Have you ever found yourself maybe in a political discussion or just, scrolling through the news online and you get that feeling that people are just talking right past each other?
Oh, definitely. All the time.
Yeah, and they're using the exact same words. Big words like freedom or democracy, maybe justice, but it's so clear they mean completely different things.
Fundamentally different, yeah.
How can you have, say, two opposing sides in a conflict, both saying they're fighting to defend freedom? Their ideas of what that actually looks like couldn't be more opposed.
It seems baffling on the surface.
It really does. It feels like it should be simple, right? Like just a mix-up in words, something you could fix with a dictionary. But what if it's deeper? What if the very core of political argument isn't just about disagreeing on policies or even facts, but it's actually this huge struggle over what those words legitimately mean?
That's exactly it. That's the core idea we're diving into today. Absolutely. This isn't like a small point about semantics or just bad communication. This fight over meaning, it's absolutely fundamental. It's central to understanding politics itself, all the messiness and conflict.
Right.
It's why communication breaks down so often. It's why conflicts can escalate so quickly. And it's precisely why, as you just said, whole countries can be at odds with both sides genuinely believing they're the ones upholding justice or democracy, but for totally different reasons.
So the argument isn't if justice is good.
No, usually not. It's about what the word justice even means in the first place. What does it signify?
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. We want to explore the uses and maybe more importantly, the uses of political concepts.
The subtle ones and the not so subtle ones.
Exactly. We're drawing heavily today from Andrew Haywood's work, Key Concepts in Politics. It's really insightful stuff.
It really is.
And for you, listening, the goal here is pretty simple. We want to give you a kind of shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. By the time we're done, you should feel, hopefully, much better equipped to sort of decipher the political language you hear every day.
To spot the hidden assumptions.
Right. To identify those assumptions that really shape the debates and just get a much deeper feel for what's really being argued about when these big, powerful words get thrown around. The deep significance of political concepts. Why words matter so much in politics. Okay, so let's really dig into this core idea, political argument as a battle for meaning. It's easy to think debates are mostly about concrete things, should we raise taxes, lower them, what's the best healthcare setup?
The tangible stuff?
Yeah, the tangible stuff. But Haywood, our source, makes it super clear that the disagreements go way deeper than that. He argues political argument is inherently a struggle over the legitimate meaning of terms.
It's such a crucial point because when you see like opposing political groups or even actual enemies in a conflict, both claiming they're defending freedom or upholding democracy, that's probably the clearest illustration you can get of this whole struggle.
It really brings it home.
Yeah, and the real issue isn't just that words like freedom, democracy, justice mean different things to different people. It's that these different meanings aren't just, interesting trivia for academics. They are a deep, often overlooked cause of actual real-world conflict and just massive misunderstanding.
So how does that play out, practically speaking?
Well, think about justice. Maybe for me, justice means ensuring absolute equality of opportunity. Everyone starts fair no matter what, right? Individual effort is key.
Okay, got it.
But maybe for you, justice means ensuring something closer to equality of outcome, maybe through, say, significant redistribution. True justice, in your view, means everyone shares pretty equally in what society produces.
Right, very different focuses.
Totally different. So how could we possibly have a useful conversation about, a new tax policy meant to achieve justice if our basic understanding of that word is miles apart?
We just talk past each other.
Exactly. The concepts themselves become problematic, as Haywood puts it, because their core meanings are always up for grabs, always being contested.
It really is like trying to navigate with a map where everyone's definition of north is different. Imagine a big debate about foreign policy.
Okay.
One side might argue for, say, significant military action overseas. They'd say it's crucial for global stability, defining stability as maybe keeping rogue states in check and promoting a specific kind of world order.
Right, an active role.
But then the other side might fiercely oppose that same action, arguing that real global stability comes from things like economic aid, strengthening international bodies, staying out of other countries' business. For them, stability is like the absence of war, shared prosperity.
Non-interference.
Both sides are using the word stability, but their meanings lead to completely opposite policies. The real fight isn't about whether stability is good.
Of course stability is good.
Right. It's about what stability is and how you get there. What about you listening? Does this ring a bell? How often do you think this kind of fight over meaning is happening just beneath the surface of the political stuff you see or hear every day?
It's everywhere once you start looking for it.
Mm.
And this leads us straight into the three pillars Haywood identifies for why these concepts are just so critically important in political analysis.
Okay, pillar one.
Pillar one is that political analysis usually deals in generalizations. This is a really key difference, setting it apart from fields like history.
How so?
Well, think about a historian. They might spend their whole career getting into the nitty-gritty of, say, the French Revolution. Every detail, every specific event.
Right, the specifics of that revolution.
Or maybe the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Eastern European revolutions in 89 and 91. They're focused on the unique, the particular event.
The one-offs, essentially.
Pretty much. For a historian, spending ages on the abstract concept of revolution might not be that useful, because their job is to understand what made that specific set of events happen exactly the way it did.
Okay.
But for a political analyst, it's almost the opposite. We're deeply interested in the phenomenon of revolution itself. We absolutely look at those specific cases, yes, but always trying to see the bigger picture.
Define patterns.
Exactly. To spot patterns, identify common causes, recurring outcomes across different times, different places, different systems. This focus on the general concept isn't just like a choice. Haywood says it's necessary. It's the very process through which political inquiry proceeds.
So it's fundamental to how political science even works.
Right. It's how we build theories about political behavior, how we identify maybe universal drivers of change, how we understand the dynamics that keep popping up. Without general concepts, we just have this overwhelming list of unique historical moments with no way to connect them or understand the forces at play.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't build a theory of something if you only look at one example. You need the abstract idea, the concept, to see those broader patterns.
Okay, so pillar number 2. This is where I think things start to get a bit tricky, where the potential for abuse really comes in.
Yeah, this one's crucial. It's the big overlap between the language we use as students of politics and the language used by actual political practitioners. You know, the politicians, the policymakers, the activists, the lobbyists.
We're using the same words.
We're largely using the same vocabulary, yes. But this overlap creates this constant tension. Because while we, as analysts or informed citizens, are hopefully aiming for political understanding, clarity, accuracy, trying to get things right, professional politicians, they're primarily interested in political advocacy.
Pushing agenda.
Pushing an agenda, winning arguments, mobilizing support, which means they have this really strong, often unavoidable incentive to use language, not necessarily to clarify things, but maybe to manipulate and sometimes confuse.
How does that work in practice? Well, think about how a skilled politician might use a word like patriotism, or maybe reform. They might throw it into a speech without ever really defining what they mean by it.
Keep it vague.
Exactly. Keep it vague so different people in the audience can hear what they want to hear. For one person, patriotism might mean, unquestioning loyalty. For someone else, it might mean actively challenging the government to make the country better.
And the politician gets support from both.
Potentially, yes. They benefit from that fuzziness. It lets them build a broader coalition or subtly shift the terms of debate without anyone really noticing. It's like linguistic maneuvering.
A kind of verbal sleight of hand.
That's a good way to put it. And this puts a huge responsibility on us, right, as students of politics or just as citizens trying to make sense of it all. Haywood says we must be especially careful in their use of language.
We have to be precise.
We have to define our terms clearly, refine concepts with precision, specifically to safeguard them from the misrepresentations often current in everyday political debate.
So we need constant vigilance.
Pretty much. And think about how that affects public discussion. If the basic words we're using are constantly being stretched or blurred or redefined just for political gain, if words change meaning depending on who's speaking, how can we ever have a really meaningful debate?
It makes it almost impossible.
It makes it incredible. Yeah, the isms. A whole new language for talking about politics emerged. And the terms within that language became, as Haywood puts it, imbued with complex and often conflicting meanings. And crucially, they got loaded with value judgments and ideological implications of which their users may be unaware.
So the words themselves started carrying invisible baggage?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ideological baggage.
Mhm.
So when someone uses a word like, say, equality, they're not just saying a neutral word. They're often, consciously or not, bringing in all this history, all this philosophy, these layers of meaning from a specific ideological viewpoint.
Wow.
Yeah, this is what makes political concepts such challenging creatures, according to Haywood. They're ambiguous by nature. People are always fighting over their true meaning, and they come loaded with this hidden ideological weight that shapes how they're understood.
So you can't just take equality at face value.
You really can't. To get what someone means when they use it in an argument, you have to understand the ideological lens they're looking through. Take equality again. For a classical liberal, equality might mostly mean equality of opportunity. Everyone gets the same starting blocks, same chance to run the race. Focus is on removing barriers.
Yeah, okay.
But for a socialist, equality is probably much more about equality of outcome. They'd argue true equality means people should end up in roughly similar places, maybe through significant wealth redistribution. Big gaps are inherently unjust.
Right.
And a conservative might talk about equality before the law or maybe equal moral worth, but they'd likely push back against state action to enforce economic or social equality, maybe prioritizing tradition or individual responsibility instead.
So same word.
Same word, equality. But the meaning, the implications, the policies that follow, fundamentally different, and it all traces back to those underlying ideologies. 2, deconstructing concept, more than just a word.
Okay, so we've established why these political words are so important, so powerful. Now let's maybe peel back one more layer. What exactly is a concept anyway? It sounds basic, but Haywood clarifies it really well.
Yeah, it's helpful to define our terms, right?
Exactly. He says a concept is a general idea about something, usually expressed in a single word or a short phrase. And the crucial part, it's more than just a name for a specific thing, like a proper noun.
That distinction is absolutely key. Think about the difference between talking about your cat, Fluffy, sitting right there, and having the concept of cat.
Okay?
The concept cat isn't fluffy specifically. It's an abstract idea. It's made up of a bunch of shared characteristics. Furry mammal, usually small, domesticated, has whiskers, chases mice, that kind of thing.
It's the general blueprint.
Exactly. It's that general idea, that mental category that lets you instantly recognize any cat you see, even if you've never seen that specific one before.
So concepts are how we group things, how we make sense of the world by categorizing.
Precisely. And that applies just as much, maybe even more so, to politics, because politics is so complex. Take the concept of presidency.
Right.
It doesn't just mean the current president or any single president like Washington or Lincoln. It refers to a whole bundle of ideas about how executive power is set up in a system. The roles, the duties, the limits, the symbolism of the office itself, separate from whoever holds it.
I see. It's the abstract office.
Yes. Concepts are general in that sense. They can apply to any instance that fits the general idea. That's how we manage to organize and understand the sheer vastness and complexity of the political world. Without them, we'd just be swamped by endless unique details, unable to see connections or patterns.
And this really highlights how incredibly valuable, how necessary concepts are. Haywood calls them the fundamental tools we use for everything: thinking, criticizing, arguing, explaining, analyzing.
They're literally the building blocks of human knowledge, he says.
Yeah, and he makes this great point that just seeing the world, just perceiving stuff, doesn't automatically give us knowledge. We need concepts to actually make sense of it.
That's a really deep philosophical point, isn't it? Imagine trying to function if all you saw was just a swirl of colors and shapes, with no way to distinguish tree from car from person.
Chaos.
Utter chaos. You need those mental boxes, those concepts, to impose some kind of meaning and structure on just raw experience.
Yeah.
And it's exactly the same with politics. We don't understand politics just by watching events unfold, a protest here, a vote there. We understand it by developing and using concepts like power, legitimacy, revolution that help us make sense of those events, see the patterns, draw conclusions.
They let us connect the dots.
They let us connect the dots, abstract from specifics to general principles, and build coherent arguments about how politics works, or maybe how it should work.
But of course, like any powerful tool, there's a downside, a danger. Haywood warns that concepts, especially political ones, can be slippery customers. They're packed with values, their meanings are often fiercely debated, and sometimes, and this feels really important, they can be invested with greater substance and significance than they actually possess.
Yeah, that's the danger zone.
Right, and that's where the potential for abuse really comes in, which sets us up perfectly for the next section, looking at how these essential tools can actually become the problem. 3, navigating the spectrum, normative, descriptive, and the problem of neutrality. Okay, let's get into that slippery side of concepts now. Haywood breaks them down into two main types, which seem pretty different at first glance: normative and descriptive. Let's start with normative.
Okay.
These are basically what we often call values, right? They point to moral principles or ideals, things that should, ought, or must be brought about.
Yeah, think of big ones like liberty, rights, justice, equality, tolerance. They're all about an ideal.
They're not describing how things are, they're prescribing how things should be.
Exactly. They advance or prescribe certain forms of conduct, or they paint a picture of the ideal society. They tell us what to aim for. And because they're tied so closely to our deepest ideals, Haywood says it's difficult to disentangle political values from the moral, philosophical, and ideological beliefs of those who advance them.
My idea of justice comes from my whole worldview.
Precisely. Your beliefs about right and wrong, how the world ought to be, shaped by everything, your upbringing, your culture, your experiences, it's all baked in.
Okay, so those are the shoulds and oughts. Now the other type, descriptive concepts, sometimes called positive concepts, these are supposed to be about facts.
He is.
Right, the is. Things that supposedly have an objective and demonstrable existence. Examples Haywood gives are power, authority, order, law. These seem much more concrete, don't they?
On the surface, yeah, they do. They're often presented as neutral or value-free, like they could stand up to rigor of scientific examination.
Like science.
Kind of. There's this big push, especially mid-20th century, with positivism being really influential.
Right, the philosophy focused on observable facts.
Exactly. Positivism emphasized empirical evidence, scientific method, things you can verify. And this led some people to try and create a truly scientific study of politics. Often, normative concepts, the shoulds, got pushed aside as just metaphysical fluff, subjective opinions you couldn't actually measure or test.
So focus only on what you can see and measure.
That was the idea. Focus on observable political behavior, power dynamics you could quantify, institutions you could describe objectively.
But, and this feels like a big but, Haywood says, the problem with political concepts is that facts and values are invariably interlinked. Even the apparently descriptive ones are loaded with a set of moral and ideological implications.
So the neat separation breaks down.
It seems so. Is it ever really that clear-cut in politics?
Well, what's really fascinating here is how even something that looks purely descriptive, like authority, just can't shake off the values. You can describe authority, who has it, how they use it.
Yeah.
That's descriptive. But Haywood argues it's impossible completely to divorce the concept from value judgments about when, how, and why authority should be exercised. Nobody's truly neutral about authority in practice.
Can you give an example?
Think about a conservative viewpoint.
Yeah.
Someone who really values social order, strong institutions, tradition, they're likely to see authority as fundamentally rightful and healthy.
Necessary,
legitimate, the thing that stops society falling into chaos. They emphasize order coming from the top. Respecting authority is seen as good.
And that shapes their whole politics.
Completely.
Yeah.
But now, take an anarchist, someone who believes that all government, all law, all hierarchy is basically oppressive.
Right.
For them, authority isn't rightful or healthy. It's nakedly oppressive. It's just a tool the powerful use to control others. It's inherently illegitimate.
Wow. Okay. Same word, authority.
Same descriptive concept, authority.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely loaded with totally opposite normative baggage, depending entirely on your core ideology.
That's a really critical takeaway then.
It's huge. For you listening, it means basically all political concepts, whether they look descriptive or normative on the surface, need therefore to be understood in the light of the ideological perspectives of those who use them. You hear someone talk about order or authority, you can't just assume you know what they mean or that they see it as positive.
You always have to ask, from whose perspective?
Exactly. Whose values are baked into that seemingly neutral word? Which leads us right into this whole modern effort to tackle this head-on, the idea of political correctness.
Right, PC language. This became a big thing from the late 20th century onwards. The idea is to try and purge language of racist, sexist, and other derogatory or disparaging implications.
The core belief behind it is that language isn't neutral. It invariably reflects the power structure in society at large.
So language can reinforce inequality.
That's the argument. If the words we use subtly put down certain groups or make others seem like the default, then language itself helps keep those power imbalances in place. So the goal is to create bias-free terminology.
To level the playing field for debate.
Yeah, to make political discussion more fair, more equitable. Think about getting rid of using man or mankind for everyone, because it makes men the default.
Or shifting away from outdated and offensive terms for ethnic minorities.
Right, or even terms like third world or underdeveloped, which kind of imply that the Western way is the only way to be developed. The aim is to find language that doesn't carry that historical baggage of inequality, maybe using humanity or people or shifting from disabled to differently abled.
So it's an intentional effort to change language, to change society, and make debates fairer.
That's the aspiration, definitely. But Haywood points out it's really difficult. He says the hope of an unbiased and objective language of political discourse is illusory.
Why illusory?
Well, the argument is that, at best, you might just swap a word with negative feelings attached for one with positive feelings. But critics say that PC, especially when it gets rigid, can end up imposing its own kind of ideological straitjacket.
Oh,
They argue that trying to scrub language clean of any potential offense can actually weaken it. It might impoverish its descriptive power, and, more controversially, it might deny expression to incorrect views.
so the criticism is it might just replace one set of biased terms with another, or even shut down certain viewpoints.
That's the gist of the criticism, that by trying to sanitize language, you might actually hinder open and honest debate, even if the intentions are good. Which leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it? For you listening, can language ever be truly neutral? Just a clear window onto reality? Or is it always, inescapably, shaped by our perspectives, by power, by ideology? And if it is always shaped like that, what does that mean for our chances of ever having truly objective political conversations? 4. The battle for definition. Understanding contested concepts.
Okay, if that wasn't tricky enough, let's tackle another really fascinating, maybe even more fundamental aspect. The idea that some political concepts are essentially contested.
Ah, Galley's idea. This is a big one.
Yeah. Haywood points out that political concepts often become the subject of intellectual and ideological controversy. The fight isn't just about policy, it's about what the words themselves mean.
We see it all the time, right?
Yeah.
People fiercely arguing, both claiming they stand for true democracy or real freedom, but their ideas are totally incompatible.
Exactly. And Haywood says this disagreement is therefore one of the battlegrounds of politics itself.
It's where the fight really happens. And this is where W.B. Galley, the philosopher, comes in. Back in the 50s, he proposed this really provocative idea. He said, for some key concepts in politics, think power, justice, freedom, democracy. The disagreement runs so deep.
So fundamentally deep.
That no neutral or settled definition can ever be developed, ever. He called them essentially contested concepts.
Okay, essentially contested. What does that really mean in practice? Does it just mean arguing about them is pointless?
No, not pointless at all. It means that each of these big words, like democracy, actually holds within it a number of rival concepts. And crucially, none of those rival versions can claim to be the one true, universally accepted meaning.
So there's no single right answer.
According to Galley, for these specific concepts, no. There isn't one final correct definition waiting to be discovered. Acknowledging this isn't giving up, though. It's about recognizing that these competing versions of the concept may be equally valid, at least from different viewpoints, different ideologies.
So it shifts the goal.
Exactly. Instead of searching for the definition, you focus on understanding the range of legitimate meanings and, really importantly, why those different meanings exist. It forces you to see the plurality, the inherent disagreement, as a core feature of politics, not a problem to be solved. You start asking, okay, whose version of justice are we even talking about here, and why do they see it that way?
That's a really helpful way to look at it. It stops you from just banging your head against a wall trying to find the one true meaning. But like any big idea, Galley's concept of essentially contested concepts has faced pushback, right? Particularly from Terence Ball later on.
Yes, definitely. Ball raised some important criticisms in the late 80s. There's sort of two main lines of attack.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is simply observing that even when theorists analyze these supposedly, essentially contested concepts, they often still end up arguing strongly for their own preferred definition.
I still pick a side.
They still pick a side. Ball suggests this very act implies that the debate isn't necessarily endless or fundamentally irresolvable. Maybe the ongoing argument could actually lead to the emergence of a single agreed concept someday, if one interpretation becomes persuasive enough or dominant enough.
So maybe they're not essentially contested forever, just contested right now.
That's the implication. The contestability might not be baked into the concept's DNA for all time. Maybe consensus is possible down the line through enough debate or historical change.
Interesting. And the second criticism, you said it argues Galli's idea is ahistorical.
Exactly. This critique says Galli treats concepts as if their contested nature is somehow fixed, outside of time. But history shows that's not always the case.
How so?
Well, take democracy again. We talked about how fiercely debated it is now. But Haywood points out this intense disagreement really only kicked off from the late 18th century, alongside the rise of new ideologies and revolutions.
Right, before that.
Before that, for long stretches of history, democracy wasn't universally loved or even widely debated in the same way. It was often seen negatively, as mob rule, or maybe as something only workable in tiny ancient city-states. It wasn't this global ideal everyone was fighting over the meaning of.
So the level of contestation changes over time.
Precisely. This suggests that how contested a concept is might not be inherent or essential to the concept itself. It might be a product of its time, shaped by current ideologies, social conditions, power struggles. So maybe instead of essentially contested, it's more accurate to say they are, as Birch suggested, currently contested, or, as Ball put it, contingently contested, depending on the historical context.
So the battle over meaning isn't fixed, it evolves with history and politics.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process. V beyond words. The fetishism of concepts.
Okay, we've covered concepts as tools, as weapons, as battlegrounds for meaning, but Haywood introduces one final and maybe the most, philosophically deep problem, the fetishism of concepts.
Yeah, this is a fascinating twist.
He describes it as happening when concepts are treated as though they have a concrete existence separate from the human beings who use them. Basically, when words are treated as things rather than as devices for understanding things.
Mistaking the map for the territory, essentially.
Exactly. Why is this such a crucial abuse?
Because it can lead to really uncritical thinking, to dogmatism, to applying ideas rigidly where they don't fit. When you treat an abstract idea as if it's a real, solid thing out there in the world, you might follow it blindly. You stop questioning its usefulness, its context, its potential negative consequences.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about when people talk about the will of the people, as if it's this single, unified, almost mystical force that must be obeyed.
Right, but people are diverse, opinions are messy.
Exactly. Public opinion is complex, contradictory, shifting.
Yeah.
Treating the will of the people as a concrete thing ignores all that complexity. It becomes a fetish, a word used to shut down debate rather than understand reality. Or think about invoking the market with a capital M as if it's this all-powerful natural force whose decisions are beyond question.
Instead of seeing it as a human system we created and can shape.
Precisely. It turns a concept into an idol.
So how do we guard against this? Against fetishizing our concepts? Haywood brings in Max Weber here.
Weber and his ideal types. A brilliant tool for this exact problem.
So what is an ideal type?
Weber developed it as a specific kind of concept. It's a mental construct, he said, where you try to make sense of incredibly complex reality by creating a kind of logical extreme. You exaggerate certain features to make them clearer.
Okay, like a pure model.
Kind of. But crucially, and this is the key to avoiding fetishism, ideal types are explanatory tools, not approximations of reality. They're not meant to be perfect pictures of how things actually are, and they're definitely not an ethical ideal. They're not saying how things should be.
They're just lenses to look through.
Exactly. Analytical lenses sharpened to highlight specific aspects of reality so you can compare the messy real world against that pure idealized model.
So concepts like democracy or human rights or capitalism, are these good examples of ideal types?
Yes, Haywood suggests they are. As ideal types, they are more rounded, coherent than the unshapely realities they seek to describe. Weber himself used authority, breaking it down into charismatic, traditional, legal rational types and bureaucracy as ideal types.
So when you study a real bureaucracy, you don't expect it to be perfect.
No, you compare it to the ideal type of bureaucracy to see where it deviates, what makes it unique, what its flaws or strengths are. You don't dismiss it as not a real bureaucracy just because it doesn't perfectly match the abstract definition.
Okay, so what's the big takeaway here for us listening? Why is recognizing concepts as ideal types so important?
Because, as Haywood concludes, it underlines the fact that concepts are only analytical tools. And if they're just tools, then concepts aren't true or false in some absolute way. They're simply more or less useful.
Wow, that's a huge shift. So the argument isn't, is this concept right? But is this concept helpful for understanding this specific situation?
Exactly. It moves us away from those rigid, often dead-end debates about absolute truth towards a much more practical, flexible way of thinking. How useful is this concept as a tool right now?
That's really powerful. And building on this idea that concepts are tools, contingent, potentially misleading, Haywood introduces some even more radical critiques, starting with postmodern theorists.
Ah, yes, postmodernism. Always ready to shake things up.
They famously attacked the traditional search for universal values,
Uh,
right? Their argument being that seeking universal truths assumes there's some kind of objective high ground, some moral and rational high point we can judge everything from.
And they fundamentally question whether such a high point actually exists.
Why?
Well, they look at the sheer persistence of deep disagreement. The fact that humans have never, ever reached universal consensus on big things like justice or freedom or truth itself.
That disagreement isn't a sign of failure.
No, they argue it suggests a plurality of legitimate ethical and political positions. There isn't just one right way to see things. From this perspective, our language, our political concepts, our knowledge claims they're only valid only in terms of the context in which they are generated and employed.
So meaning is always local, always contextual, no universal truths.
Pretty much. It's tied to specific cultures, specific histories, specific power dynamics, which of course throws a huge wrench into any grand theory claiming to have found the universal answer or solution for politics.
Okay, that's a major challenge. And then maybe the most radical critique of all comes from Mahayana Buddhism.
Yes, an ancient philosophical tradition with a really profound take on this. Mahayana Buddhism distinguishes between two kinds of truth: conventional truth and absolute truth.
Conventional versus absolute.
Conventional truth is the everyday world we operate in. It's based on shared agreement, literary convention. We all agree chair means that thing you sit on, and that lets us communicate and function.
Makes sense.
But absolute truth, in this view, goes beyond concepts entirely. It involves the penetration of reality through direct experience, and so it transcends conceptualization.
Wow, so thinking itself gets in the way.
From this perspective, yes. Thinking of all kinds amounts to a projection imposed upon reality, and therefore constitutes a form of delusion. Our concepts, while useful for the conventional world, are ultimately just mental labels we stick onto reality. If we mistake those labels for reality itself,
We get trapped.
we get trapped. We miss the deeper reality that can only be experienced directly, without the filter of concepts. There's that famous Zen saying Haywood quotes.
The finger pointing at the moon.
Exactly. If we mistake words for things, we are in danger of mistaking the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself.
Ah, the concept points towards reality, moon, but it isn't reality itself. Mistaking one for the other is the ultimate danger of concept fetishism.
Perfectly put. It's a powerful reminder that even our most sophisticated tools for understanding can become obstacles if we forget they are just tools, just pointers, not the thing itself. Outro.
Wow. Okay, what a journey that was. Intellectually stimulating doesn't quite cover it, does it?
Definitely gave the brain a workout.
Yeah. So we started with that common feeling, people talking past each other using the same words, and discovered it's often because political argument is this deep battle over meaning. Words like freedom, justice, they're battlegrounds.
Then we looked at why words matter so much in politics, how they're essential for generalizing and building theories,
Right, but also how easily they can be manipulated by politicians for advocacy.
and how they're almost always tangled up with hidden ideological beliefs.
We unpacked what a concept even is, that general idea, that vital tool for thinking. And then we got into the tricky stuff, normative versus descriptive concepts.
And how that neat line always seems to blur in politics. Facts and values are just inseparable.
Yeah, and even attempts at bias-free language like political correctness face really deep challenges.
Then we explored Galli's essentially contested concepts, the idea that for some key terms, maybe there is no single right answer, just valid rival interpretations.
And finally, that profound danger of concept fetishism, mistaking our words, our mental maps, for the actual territory. Whether that's through ignoring Weber's idea of ideal types as just tools.
Or confronting those really radical critiques from postmodernism and Buddhism, reminding us that concepts might even obscure reality if we cling to them too tightly.
The big takeaway, words in politics are almost never innocent. They're loaded, contested, and can be seriously misleading if we're not careful.
Absolutely.
So, connecting all this back to you listening, hopefully this deep dive gives you some new tools, some new lenses. You're maybe better equipped now to spot when a debate is really about definitions deep down, not just surface policies.
Or when a concept is being twisted for political gain.
Or when an abstract idea is being treated like a concrete thing, an idol, instead of just a useful or maybe not so useful tool.
It's about being a more discerning participant, really, cutting through the noise.
Yeah, actually, being able to see the underlying currents in the political conversation.
Which brings us to maybe one last thought for you to chew on, building on all this. Go for it. Given everything we've said, that our most basic political concepts are loaded with ideology, endlessly fought over, and can even be mistaken for reality itself, what responsibility does that put on you? Not just to question the words you hear others use, but maybe, more importantly, to really critically examine the concepts that shape your own understanding of the political world. Where do your concepts come from? How useful are they really? Are you ever mistaking the finger for the moon?
That's a deep one to end on, a lot to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep thinking critically and keep diving deep.